Hey guys, today we're in the book of Genesis, chapter 41. We're continuing on with the story of Joseph. And so notice the very first verse. It says, After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. 2 years, Joseph was in prison. A lot of times we think that we're in bad spots and we want God to deliver right now, but God has a plan and we have no idea where we're at in that plan. Just yesterday, we talked about Jericho. We don't know if we're in lap one, lap five, or lap 12, right? We don't know where we're at, but Joseph was in jail, but he was still a part of God's plan. So, being in jail for 2 years, God had sent these dreams to Pharaoh. And so he has these dreams. There's two dreams. There's one about cows, there's one about corn. They're both the same, and we'll see that in just a minute. In verse 8, it says, So in the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for the magicians of Egypt and all the wise men. These dreams weren't just dreams, these dreams were important. He could tell that these dreams meant something more than just a nighttime fantasy. There was something more to them. And so he sent off for the smartest people of Egypt, which would have been the smartest people of the world, but they couldn't answer it. And in verse 9, it says, The chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today. Nobody could interpret the dreams. And all of a sudden, the cupbearer remembers 2 years ago when he was in jail, there was a guy who could interpret his dreams. And he says, I remember my offenses. If you remember, Joseph told the cupbearer, Do not forget me. Tell Pharaoh about me. But he did forget him. And so the cupbearer repents and he says, Oh my goodness, I forgot about this guy. I forgot what I told him I would do. I'm so sorry. And he tells Pharaoh, There's a guy who interpreted my dreams and the baker's dreams, and both of the dreams came true. And then Pharaoh, verse 14, sent and called Joseph. And notice says, And they quickly brought him up out of the pit. 2 years in jail, 2 years forgotten, and all of a sudden, quickly, right? And a lot of times, it seems like we are in jail. We are not getting what we want. God is holding us back for something. And then all of a sudden, everything starts to click and God's plan moves in. And that's exactly what happens. And so Pharaoh asked him, Can you interpret my dreams? And notice what he says. Joseph answered in verse 16, It is not in me. I cannot answer your dreams, but God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. He's standing before the most powerful man in the world, and and the most powerful man says, Can you do this? He's lifting him up. And Joseph had a choice. He could elevate himself or elevate God. And Joseph, which he always has done, elevates God. And so he says, It's not me. I'm not the interpreter. God is the interpreter. And so God will give you a favorable answer. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, thinking about that, the most powerful man in the world is asking an inmate to give him help. And so he explains the dreams that 7 fat cows come out of the Nile and they eat 7 puny cows, but the cows don't get bigger. You would think that they would eat another cow, they would get bigger, but they don't. 7 sheaves of corn was on one stalk, and then 7 puny corn come up later. And Pharaoh is confused, but God is not confused. And so we see Joseph said to Pharaoh, verse 25, The dreams of Pharaoh are one. The cows and the corn are the same dream. They're telling you the exact same thing. The 7 cows are 7 years of good bumper crops, of good water, of good living, of good harvest, and then 7 bad years will follow. In verse 28, it is as I told Pharaoh, God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. God sent dreams to a pagan man, Pharaoh, for the release and the position and the salvation of Joseph that he would be there so that all of Israel would come to Egypt. We talked yesterday about Rahab. Why would God send in two spies to Rahab? It's because God knew that Rahab was going to be saved. He did this for Rahab's salvation. Why would he allow all this to happen? It's for Joseph's salvation, but yet for all of Israel's salvation. These little bitty events are all because God's love and God's power and sovereignty over the universe. Verse 32, and the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that this thing is fixed by God. He's saying it's definitely going to happen, and it's going to be happening shortly. It's going to be happening immediately. And in verse 33, we see something shifts. All the verses before this, Joseph has been giving him knowledge. This is the interpretation of the dreams. Now, in verse 33, we get to see an insight to Joseph. He's not just an interpreter of the dreams, but he is a smart man. We start to see knowledge as verses 1 through 32. Starting in verse 33, we get to see a little bit of wisdom. Okay, he gave knowledge, now he's giving wisdom. So Joseph says, I interpret the dreams, but let me tell you, Pharaoh, how you can use this. And he says, you need a discerning and wise man. And Pharaoh proceeded to point out overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce. So here Joseph says, here's the deal. You need a guy to lead this. You need a lot of officers and overseers. You need an administration to come along to help that one man. And you need to collect 20% of all the grain. Now, we know in history that Pharaoh always collected a tenth, 1/10 of all the grain and all of the produce for his keeping in the kingdom. Here, Joseph is saying you need to double the taxes. How does that work? How would it be in this political year if either candidate said, I want to double your taxes? We would hate that, right? We would hate that. But in the doubling of taxes, we're going to see that it's going to keep them alive. But it proves that there's God's hand on this moment. If somebody came and said, hey, I want to double your taxes, all of Egypt would have let a revolt, but they didn't. They gave their 20%. And did it cheerfully and willfully, maybe not cheerfully, but they did it willfully, and God honored them through that. And so it says, hey, you need a man to do this. In verse 37, it says the proposal pleased Pharaoh and all of his servants. Pharaoh accepted this, heard this, and said, I do need a man. And he said, can we find a guy, notice this, in whom is the Spirit of God? Underline that, circle that. This is the first time in all of the Bible that you have read that the Holy Spirit rests on mankind. This is the first time you've seen this. We know this as a New Testament thought. We'll see this as we continue to read through some of the prophets speaking of the future. But here in Genesis, this is the first time where a pagan man, right, Pharaoh, says, whom will we find who has the Spirit of God, who have the Holy Spirit that is resting upon that man? And we're going to see that is the man of Joseph. And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, or my people, and my land, and there will be no one greater than you. Pharaoh gives him authority over his personal affairs, over the people, over the land, over everyone. He makes him the number 2 of Egypt. He takes off the signet ring, which gives him authority. It says it takes his clothes off and puts him in fine linen. He goes from prison rags to fine linen. He goes from prison chains to golden chains, and he gives him a second chariot, whereas a slave, he would have walked everywhere he went. Now he rides everywhere he goes. And thus everything happened. He was set in charge of everything. And even says, without your consent, no one shall lift up a hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. Joseph had authority over every single person other than Pharaoh. Pharaoh gives him a wife. He becomes married. And notice verse 46. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered into service of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. If you remember all the way back when we started talking about Joseph, Joseph was how old when he was sold into slavery? 17 years old. For 13 years, Joseph has not had the life that he's wanted. For 13 years, he has probably felt like God has abandoned him, but all that has happened because God had a plan for him. He spent those years walking around, right? 13 laps of Jericho, 13 years of Joseph, because God had a plan. He had a plan of salvation and a plan of defeat for Joseph. And so what happens? Joseph did all what he said. He gathered up all of the food and did well. And notice in verse 49, it says he stored up grain in great abundance. Remember, Pharaoh has taken 10% all the time. Now there's 20%. There's been such an abundance that it says that he lost count. It could not be measured. We see that Joseph has two kids. One of them is Manasseh, and the other one is Ephraim. Manasseh means forgetfulness. Because he named him, that says, God has made me forget the hardships, everything I've went through. And Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. And so forgetfulness and fruitfulness, that's what those two names mean. You need to circle those names because they will become very, very important as we continue to read and build up our knowledge of Israel to come. And so everything happens. There's 7 years of plenty, then there's 7 years of famine. In all of Egypt there was bread. Verse 56, and the famine had spread all over the land, and Joseph opened all the storehouses, and notice this, and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land. A lot of people do not believe this story because Joseph's not mentioned in the Egyptian dynasties. There's no historical record, which is not really uncommon. There's a lot of pharaohs not mentioned. But you would say, why would a pharaoh let a slave into Egypt? Simple. He doubled the taxes. Joseph took the blame of the taxes. And then when there was a famine, he sold the surplus that he already taxed. He sold them back to them. Joseph made Pharaoh a very, very rich man. Joseph made Pharaoh the most loved Pharaoh of all times because he saved their life for planning for this famine. So maybe in the first 7 years, everybody wasn't fond of Pharaoh and Joseph. But that first year of famine, when it comes back, Pharaoh become super rich, more rich than probably any other Pharaoh up until this point. And they loved him because he planned for them. He looked after them. And so that you can start to see the picture of why would Pharaoh allow this to happen? He became rich. He became loved, which makes him more powerful. Verse 57, moreover, all the earth came to Egypt, to Joseph, to buy grain. And so all of the earth had a famine. And so now all the earth is coming in to Egypt to talk to Joseph, to Egypt's number two, to God's man who he planted in the middle of Egypt. Hope that makes sense. And in this, you would ask yourself, where is Jesus in this? As I've told you in the previous, Jesus is Joseph. Joseph is Jesus. They go together in so many ways. And so when we think about Joseph in this story, it's Jesus in this story, that he is there to come along and to help and to keep us and to sustain us when we cannot sustain ourselves. When what we have is not enough, he has what is enough. Hope that makes sense. We'll see you tomorrow in chapter 42. God bless.